And welcome to week 7 of our online judge class. My name is John Aratinji.
And I'm Stacy Winchell, and we are both level 2 judges from Rochester, Minnesota. And today, this week's class will be about state-based actions.
Or triggered abilities.
Apologies.
Last week we talked about state-based actions.
This week's class will be about state-based actions.
One second.
And the technical difficulties keep going. So for those of you who tried to watch the class we put up last night, will know that apparently we didn't have sound.
This week we do have sound, which is...
At least we assume we have sound.
It helps. Because that was a window which was apparently open to our broadcast.
Oh, okay. So we have sound.
We have sound this week.
At least we know we have sound today.
It's an improvement.
So anyways, yes, today's test is on triggered ability, or today's class is on triggered abilities. But first, before we go to that, we're going to look at our practice test from last week, which was about state-based actions.
Now, for those of you who may be watching us live, just a couple of things about our technology this evening. So we're using Google Hangouts on Air, and we have a couple of nice features. Now, up in the corner, there is a 3x3 box of little white boxes. You can click on that and switch between our two tools we're going to be using today, the question and answer and the showcase. So the question and answer, at any point during our class, if you have any questions at all, please post them there. We'll be able to see it as you post it and
give you a live response.
Yeah. The other thing, our showcase has... we're able to post links in there. So currently in there, it has both the practice test from last week, as well as the outline to the class, which we'll be working off of today for today's lesson. So with that said, let's just jump right into going over the practice test.
All right. So question number 1: what are 3 state-based actions that involve a player losing the game? What are 3 state-based actions that involve a permanent, other than a creature, going to the graveyard? So state-based actions that involve a player losing the game is a player having 0 or less life, a player attempting to draw a card from an empty library, a player with 10 or more poison counters, or a player having received 21 or more damage from any commander in a commander game. State-based actions that involve a permanent other than a creature going to the graveyard, an aura that's not attached to a creature or attached to an illegal permanent, 2 or more planeswalkers of the same type and controller, 2 or more legendary permanents with the same name, exact name and same controller, and 2 or more world enchantments, no matter who owns them, and a planeswalker with 0 loyalty counters.
Yeah. Those are all the possible ones you could have gotten for that. So number 2, what are 2 state-based actions that involve a permanent becoming unattached? So whenever an equipment, fortification of aura becomes attached,
becomes attached.
Yeah. Whenever it becomes attached to a creature or player with protection from that specific object, it becomes unattached. If a creature becomes attached to another creature or player, it also becomes unattached. So
more often this happens of something that was an equipment that's attached to a creature turns into a creature itself, and creatures can't equip other creatures.
Yep. And the first part was just talking about things can't enchant, equip, whatnot, something with protection from them. So
I'm going to pause us because I can tell already we're losing it a little bit. Normally when we do these, it's like 4 hours earlier in the night. So I apologize if we're missing things and we're screwing up tonight. This is the best time we had available to redo this after we found out last night about last night's snafu with the sound. So all right, continuing on. What are 2 state-based actions that involve counters on permanents? Whenever a permanent states that it can have no more than a certain number of counters on it, any counters that it somehow got in excess of that number are removed. The other state-based action involving counters is whenever a creature has both -1/-1 counters and +1/+1 counters, you remove 1 counter of each type until only 1 type of those counters remain. Note this is very specific to -1/-1 counters and +1/+1 counters. If you have Baron Singer, which hands out +2/+2 counters, those can't get taken off by -1 counters. There's no state-based action for that. Also, if you have a Wall of Roots in play, and then you're activating your Gavney Township, you have 2 dice. You have your -0, -1 counters, and your +1/+1 counters.
Yeah.
So, excuse me.
All right. Number 4. What are 3 state-based actions that involve a creature going to the graveyard? So a creature with lethal damage marked on it that has toughness greater than 0, non-zero toughness, it will be put into the graveyard as a state-based action. Also, a creature that was dealt damage by a source with Death Touch since the last time state-based actions were checked, and also a creature with 0 or less toughness. Now, it should be noted that the first 2, having been dealt lethal damage but having toughness 1 or greater, as well as having been dealt Death Touch damage, those lead to it being destroyed. Whereas a creature with 0 or less toughness, it just is put into the graveyard as a state-based action. This matters for effects like Regenerate or even Indestructible, like being dealt lethal damage or Death Touch damage. Can be a creature with that can be saved by being indestructible or by being regenerated. If that creature becomes a 1/0 or 0/0 though, then it's just going to die. There's nothing to save it at that point.
All right, number 5. When are state-based actions checked? What happens if any state-based actions are processed? In what order are the state-based actions processed? So state-based actions are checked before any player would receive priority, and every time a player would receive priority. If any state-based actions are processed, the game state will reflect any changes, such as permanents leaving the battlefield. Then state-based actions are all processed again at the same time, and not done in any... I feel like I just skipped a line. Nope, that just read really weird. Okay. State-based actions are processed. The game state will reflect any changes, such as permanents leaving the battlefield. They are all processed simultaneously. So if you have multiple state-based actions that all happen at once, you do them all at the same time, and they're not done in any specific order. And then if any state-based actions are processed, then a new check is run, again, processing state-based actions to make sure nothing changed. Make sure when that Lord died, none of the other creatures that it was giving a power toughness boost to should also die.
Yeah.
And then this is repeated until no new actions are processed.
Yeah, state-based actions and the cleanup phase are 2 instances where we're just going to keep rerunning them until nothing new happens, no state-based actions happen, no triggers happen. Then we'll move on from there, and we'll talk more about triggered abilities today, obviously. But yeah, we do them all at the same time, then we check again, and then we do all the new ones at the same time. All right, so number 6. Neville controls grizzly bears enchanted by pacifism. Amy casts Shock, targeting grizzly bears. What happens after Shock resolves? Grizzly bears are just a 2/2. They're being dealt 2 damage, so when state-based actions are checked, it's going to see that it has lethal damage marked on it, and it will be put into the graveyard as a state-based action. Now, this will suddenly leave a pacifism on the battlefield without it enchanting anything. So in order that isn't enchanting anything, it will be put into the graveyard as a state-based action. So first the grizzly bears are put into the graveyard, then state-based actions check again. The pacifism is no longer enchanting anything, so then it will be put into the graveyard as well.
All right, number 7. So Nancy controls Drudge Skeletons and has already resolved its regeneration ability. Abraham casts Puncture Bolt targeting Drudge Skeletons. Is Drudge Skeletons regenerated? So Drudge Skeletons will have 1 damage marked on it, but it'll also have a -1/-1 counter on it, which reduces its toughness to 0. When state-based actions are checked, it'll see 0 toughness, and the Drudge Skeletons will go to the graveyard. Regeneration cannot replace having 0 toughness, as we mentioned earlier.
And it should be noted, since regeneration... Well, it comes a lot in these specific examples, but it's also a little bit complicated ability. It should just be noted that regeneration specifically says we're gonna, instead of instead of the next time it would be destroyed, it's like a shield. The next time this would happen, we are instead going to remove all damage from it and tap it and remove it from combat. So it's replaced the next time it would be destroyed, but in certain situations, like it having 0 toughness, it's
not actually destroyed.
It's not actually destroyed. Also, like removing lethal damage from it wouldn't keep it from being put in the graveyard anyways if it were a 0/0.
Yeah, exactly.
Like that's why we have that specifically, because it'd be like, oh, you're still 0/0. You should die.
All right. So number 8, Amy controls Gideon Jura and activates the 3rd ability, which turns Gideon Jura into a 6/6 indestructible creature with prevent all damage to it, and it's still a
Planeswalker.
Still a Planeswalker. Actually, the original one, Gideon Jura, is not indestructible. All the future ones are, but the original one was not. Anyways, then Amy casts Sakashima the Imposter, copying Gideon Jura. What happens after Sakashima the Imposter resolves? So Sakashima the Imposter is a creature for blue, and 2. It has text of being a 3/1, but really it says as it comes into the battlefield, it becomes a copy of target creature, except that its name is still Sakashima the Imposter, and it gains the ability for blue, and 2 to return it to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step. So the Sakashima comes into play as a copy of unanimated Gideon. This goes back to our talk of the week that we did copy effects. So the Gideon you activated is a creature, but your Sakashima is not currently a creature.
Because the copyable effects, as we talked about on that week, are basically just what's printed on the card.
Base characteristics of the card, yes. However, it is going to have the same type and subtype as Gideon, and due to the Planeswalker uniqueness rule, the owner of Sakashima and Gideon will have to choose one to put into their graveyard as a state-based effect.
Because they both say Planeswalker Gideon, and you can only have one Planeswalker Gideon as a type. That's a type.
Even though they have different names. Yeah. We came up with a scenario last week, or yesterday when we did this the first time, that I want to share because it's hilarious. So, Sarkhan the Dragon Speaker, his +1 is, of course, he turns into a 4/4 creature with haste until end of turn. A 4/4 flying creature with haste until end of turn. It very specifically has reminder text. He is not a Planeswalker while he's a creature. So you can actually... So you can cast Sakashima the Imposter, copying an animated Sarkhan the Dragon Speaker. Then you have a Sakashima the Imposter, which is currently a Planeswalker named type Sarkhan, but Sarkhan's not a Planeswalker, so you currently get to keep both. Then you can do the plus ability on Sakashima the Imposter, Dragon Speaker, make it a creature. They're both legendary creatures, but they have different names. Then you can swing for 8. And then you can pay Sakashima's ability, blue, and 2, to return to your hand at the beginning of the end step and get to keep both. Now, this is kind of Magical Christmas Land, but sometimes corner cases can be fun.
Yeah.
So, moving on.
All right. So Adelaide controls Grizzly Bears with Paradise Mantle and Bone Splitter attached to it. Nikki casts March of the Machines. What happens after March of the Machines resolve? So the important thing is that Paradise Mantle is a 0-cost equipment, and Bone Splitter is a 1-cost equipment, and March of the Machines is going to turn them both into creatures in addition to their other types. Creatures cannot equip creatures. That would be a massive flavor fail. Wizards was like, no, the rules do not work this way.
Correct.
First, the state-based actions are going to see, well, okay, Paradise Mantle is now a 0/0 creature equipping Grizzly Bears, and Bone Splitter is a 1/1 creature equipping Grizzly Bears. So Paradise Mantle is just going to die because that's the...
I mean, technically, because they're all state-based actions that happen at the same time, it also falls off. I think I failed this on the real-life one, too.
If one or more state-based actions would apply to it, they're all...
You do them all
together as a replacement effect.
Yeah, you do them all at the same time. So technically it falls off, but realistically it goes to the graveyard.
And Bone Splitter at the same time will just fall off. So yeah, that's pretty simple.
Pretty much it.
Yeah.
All right. So number 10, Arthur and Nancy both each control an Abyssal Persecutor and are both at 7 life. Arthur casts Hurricane with X equaling 7. What happens as Hurricane resolves? So Abyssal Persecutor is a 6/6 flying trample for 4 mana that says you can't win the game and your opponents can't lose the game. Hurricane says deal X damage to each creature with flying and each player. Going to the so your Hurricane's going to resolve. It's going to deal 7 damage to both Abyssal Persecutors and both Arthur and Nancy. We are then going to check our state-based actions. Neither player can actually currently lose the game, so the only state-based action to process is the Abyssal Persecutors. Both of them have lethal damage and are put into their owner's graveyard. Then after that, we check state-based actions again. Well, now players can lose the game, so then state-based actions are going to see that they both are going to lose the game simultaneously, which causes a draw.
Yeah. Definitely does come up if you play Commander.
Weird things like that come up all the time when you play Commander.
All right. So how can you tell if an ability is an activated ability? So activated abilities are always written as cost : effect. So the best way to look for them is just to look for the colon, because it will be there in everything. Even if it's a super old card, which for whatever reason does not follow that templating, if you look at the Oracle text for that card, it'll be in there.
And I'm fairly certain even really old cards had that one specific templating. That's why they key in on that. There's always a cost, then a colon, then an effect. So
I think there are a few exceptions, but they're few and far between.
I think the only exceptions are cards that have been functionally errated to make them actually work as intended. So
yeah.
I think that's the exception to that rule.
All right. So number 12. Anix controls Ethereum Sculptor and has 1 of each basic land. He wants to cast Etched Oracle for its full cost of 4. Can he do it? So Ethereum Sculptor allows your artifacts to cost 1 less. And Etched Oracle, the reason he wants to cast it for its full cost is because it has Sunburst. It gets a +1/+1 counter for each base or each color of mana he spends to cast it. So he wants to get 4 +1/+1 counters, but his spell should cost 3 with Ethereum Sculptor. Can he pay the full cost? No. No, he can't.
So mana reductions are not optional. Same thing, they're just like taxes. Normally, you would assume taxes aren't optional. That's the whole point of having taxes. But mana reductions are also not optional. They are always calculated when you calculate the total cost when you're casting a spell.
And you cannot just pay extra mana into spells. It's a thing I've actually wanted to do a few times in Magic, but you cannot.
So as long as we're talking about Sunburst, I'm going to do an aside. I had a couple of asides, and they don't always work the second time around, but this one kind of works. So for those of you that play Legacy, and cast a card called Engineered Explosives. Engineered Explosives has Sunburst. It costs X, and it has 2 and sacrifice it. Destroy each non-land permanent with converted mana cost equal to the number of counters on this. Yep. John's already figured out where I'm going with this. So it's, it is a thing that exists in this format. Many decks play it. There's also a card called Thalia. I don't remember what her first name was. Old Thalia. I'm going to say Old Thalia because this was the first Thalia. She says non-creature spells you cast cost 1 more to cast. You really want to blow up Thalia with your Engineered Explosives. But if you announce it for 2, Thalia makes it cost 3. So, fun fact, you can announce it for 1, then her tax puts it up to 2, then you pay your mana. Sunburst is like, well, you paid 2 different types of mana. I don't care how you got there. You have your 2 counters, and then you can proceed to blow up Thalia.
I did not think about nearly that level. I was thinking of like, oh, they have, tokens out. They have some 0-cost permanent which you want to blow up. You cannot blow it up.
Well, you can pay colorless to blow it up.
Sure, if you have a colorless.
If you have a colorless,
yes.
You can blow it up that way. But I remember the game I particularly saw this. It wasn't a problem of like, because you can always pay like 2 colors of the same color to still get the correct thing. The problem was he had exactly 4 mana. So he literally could not afford for that to cost him any more mana. So, continuing on. So, last question for this week. Abigail has Lodestone Golem and Omniscience out. What is the total cost to cast Bear Cub if Abigail chooses to use Omniscience to cast it? So, even though the spell is being paid without its mana cost, you still must pay additional costs. If you remember from when we were talking about how to cast a spell, you figure out the base cost and then you add any additional costs. Then you do any reductions, which we don't have any here. But because of the additional cost, you must still pay 1 for the Bear Cub, which is still better than 3 in this case. But
yeah. Alrighty. So that was the week 6 practice test. If there are any questions, feel free to go ahead and post them in the Q&A.
Otherwise, if you're watching this not live and our sound works this week, hopefully sound's working. Otherwise, my thumbs up right there looks really weird.
All of this looks really weird. I watched some of our video from yesterday. Yeah.
Yep. So if you're not watching us live, feel free to message the Rochester Judge class. Both of us get updates from that Facebook page. I believe our response time is like in the 15-minute range, actually.
Yes. 14 minutes.
Yeah. So if you have any questions, if you're seeing this and it's not live and you have any questions, you can feel free to message us on there. We will answer you relatively quickly and help you to the best of our ability.
Yep. But anyways, without further ado, let's just hop into this week's stuff. So we're talking about triggered abilities. All right. So triggered abilities are abilities that have a trigger condition and an effect. So they're generally written as a trigger condition, comma, effect. And they begin with the words when, whenever, or at most of the time.
99% of the time.
99% of the time.
Again, with the sometimes old cards lie to you.
Yeah. And those are really your key for triggered abilities. You look for when, whenever, or at. But they can also be expressed as when, whenever, at, a trigger condition, trigger effects. Sorry, trigger event effect. Whenever a game event or game state matches a triggered ability's trigger event, that ability automatically triggers. So it doesn't matter when it is. There's one enchantment which is, or it's a creature. It's some permanent, which says whenever your hand is empty, draw a card. So if during the resolution of Wheel of Fortune, where you discard your hand and then you draw 7 cards, well, you're going to have no hand for a second there. So it will trigger. The ability doesn't do anything at this point, though. That trigger is just waiting to go onto the stack the next time a player would get priority.
Which is probably going to be after that spell resolves.
Yeah. And like I just said, because they aren't cast or activated, they can trigger even when it isn't legal to cast spells and activate abilities.
And that's pretty much true of all triggered abilities. The ability I used in the example before, and I think it's still the best ability, is cards that have the word inspired on them from Born of the Gods. You untap permanents during your untap step. They trigger during your untap step, but they're not going to go on the stack until the next time a player receives priority, which is going to be the beginning of the next upkeep.
Yeah.
So,
when a phase or step begins, all abilities that trigger at the beginning of that phase or step trigger. So an ability triggers only once each time it triggers its trigger event occurs. However, it can trigger repeatedly if one event contains multiple occurrences. So, I mean,
a good example. There's I can't think of the specific name. There is a creature that says whenever it becomes blocked by a creature, draw a card. If your opponent blocks it with multiple creatures, you do draw multiple cards in that instance.
Yes.
Basically, every single time that the trigger condition is met, that's how many times that triggered ability will trigger.
Or there are things which, like, when it deals damage to a creature, same thing. If it dealt damage to multiple creatures at once, it would trigger.
Yep.
But anyways, some trigger events use the word becomes. So becomes is specifically talking about when and it's like becomes tapped or becomes blocked or there are some which don't use the word becomes but have the same functional meaning, like whenever it attacks, which basically means becomes attacking. These
English
trigger,
language, everybody.
Yeah, these trigger only at the time the named event happens. So if you have something put into play blocking a creature, or you put it into play already attacking, it's not going to trigger any events which say, when it attacks or when it blocks, as the case may be.
Or that becomes tapped. Like if it enters the battlefield tapped, it never became tapped. It never had a state before being tapped where it then became tapped.
Yeah.
Think of it that way. It never existed before being tapped, or before becoming blocked, or before it was attacking. And without the state before it, it cannot become what you're talking about.
Yeah. Also, to be noted, an event that's prevented or replaced won't trigger anything.
Which we'll get to replacement effects at the end of this week, because it's relevant. There's several of the abilities that we go through at the end, which I'll remember from last week, that we just go through it at the end, and it kind of covers a lot of it. But yes, as John said, any event that's being replaced won't trigger anything. A good example is Cletus. With anything, if I have a Cletus and John has Zulaport Cutthroat, he doesn't get to drain me because his creatures never go to the graveyard. They are replaced on their way to the graveyard. They are sent to the exile zone, and I get a zombie instead.
Yep.
And he is a sad person.
So it doesn't matter whenever my creatures die effects I have out, if they don't end up dying, if they don't end up going from the battlefield to the graveyard, it won't trigger. Even if they were supposed to and something changed it.
Yeah. All right. So, excuse me. Once an ability has triggered, it becomes the topmost object on the stack. It has the text of the ability that created it and no other characteristics. It remains on the stack until it's either countered, resolves, or a rule causes it to be removed from the stack, or an effect moves it elsewhere. The last couple are kind of rare. It's usually until it's countered or resolves. A triggered ability is controlled by the player who controlled its source at the time it triggered. If multiple abilities have triggered since the last time a player received priority, each player in active player, non-active player order puts their triggered abilities on the stack in the order they choose. So if I have 3 things go on the stack and I'm the active player and John has 2 things, I'll put my 3 things on the stack in the order I choose, and then he'll put his 2 on top. And then, of course, they'll resolve in opposite order, because you resolve the stack top down. Then, once you put all of the triggered abilities on the stack, the game checks for state-based actions until none are performed. Then the abilities that trigger during this process finally actually go on the stack. This process repeats until no new state-based actions are performed and no new abilities trigger. Then the appropriate player gets priority to respond to all the triggers that happen.
Yep. So just like our cleanup step and our state-based actions, triggered abilities going on the stack is just going to keep repeating until nothing new happens.
Yes.
So if a triggered ability is modal, its controller announces the mode choice when he or she puts the ability on the stack. You have an example.
Yes. So I know it's about to rotate from standard in about a month here, but Ojutai Exemplars, it just says whenever you cast a non-creature spell, choose one. And it's got 3 options. You can either tap target creature an opponent controls, it can exile itself, then return itself to the battlefield tapped, or I don't remember the third one. I think put a +1/+1 counter on itself. Basically, if the triggered ability is modal like that, the controller announces which mode they're choosing when they put the ability on the stack, just like modal choices for spells. If one of the modes would be illegal, you can't choose that mode. If none of the modes can be chosen, the ability is removed from the stack. If you play Moto at all, it never even gets to go on the stack. The remainder of the process for putting a triggered ability on the stack is identical for the process of casting a spell. If there's a choice required when the triggered ability goes on the stack, but no legal choices can be made for it, or if a rule or continuous effect otherwise makes the ability illegal, the ability is simply removed from the stack.
Now, it should be noted, it follows the rules for casting a spell, so like you have to choose targets, all that stuff.
Damage assignment order.
Yeah, damage assignment order. One thing it doesn't do is cost. So any costs, you're not going to pay them during, the ability triggering it, and we'll get to that. But triggered abilities will always go on the stack. Any costs will get paid at the end.
Technically, the way those are written is technically they're all in intervening ifs, which we actually literally go into next. So,
Yep.
yeah. So, triggered abilities. There are some triggered abilities that may read when, whenever, at, trigger event, if condition, effect. It's kind of wordy and weird. Basically, it's your when, whenever, at, something happens, and then if something else is true,
Actually,
then you get your effect.
They're not if. They're not intervening if. But
no,
they're when this creature attacks, you may pay 1. If you do,
oh, they're not intervening if because they always go on the stack. Yeah. Okay.
Yep. But
we'll just talk about them quick. So like those types of things, they give you a choice on resolution. Oh no, they're farther down.
Okay. Anyways,
all right.
Intervening if.
Talk about intervening if. So I brought it up last time, yesterday when we did this, and I'm going to do it again. There are some languages, for those of you that live in may or may not live in localities with multiple languages, there are some languages where the intervening if clause does not translate. The particular language I know that is the worst is Japanese. In Japanese, intervening if clauses do not translate at all. Japanese players just have to memorize what clause in English is an intervening if and which clause in English is not. Important to note that the official rulings on a card are always the English language version. Anything else is just translated from that.
Yes.
But intervening if. So when the trigger event occurs, the ability is going to check whether the stated condition is true. So let's see.
Valakut.
Yeah, Valakut, great example. And it's in a Tier 1 Modern deck, so why not? So Valakut says, whenever a mountain enters the battlefield, if you control 5 or more other mountains, Valakut deals 3 damage to target creature or player. So you play your land, and Valakut's like, hey, how many other mountains are there? And it's like, well, it's turn 4. There's only 3 other. There's only 2 other mountains other than this one. Since your condition is not true, the if part is not true, the ability doesn't even go on the stack. Now, let's say it's later in the game. Let's say you've done your scape shift, and you have your 6 other mountains, and you've brought them all into play at the same time with your Valakut, and Valakut's, the mountains are like, hey, we all came into play. Valakut's like, well, there are 6 of you, so you get to all go on the stack.
Yeah, because each one sees 5 other mountains.
Because each one sees 5 other mountains. Like, literally how the scape shift deck wins the game. So they all go on the stack. Now, the other important thing to know with the intervening if clause is the intervening if, anything that has that if condition, will check again on resolution. So let's say John's playing scape shift, and he's just trying to do his combo, and all of his triggers from Valakut are on the stack. If I'm a dirty blue player, I shouldn't say that. Blue players, we love you equally. If I'm a blue player and I have some effects that return mountains to his hand, and now he only has 4 mountains in play, those triggers, they're still on the stack, but they go to resolve and they check again and realize, whoa, we don't have as many mountains as we thought. I guess we don't get to deal damage.
Yep. So yeah, the big thing there is just it will check. So all all triggered abilities are going to have some trigger event which they check when it happens, and the if condition is basically an addendum to the trigger event for checking if this is going to go on the stack right away. The difference with intervening if clauses is that you also check the if condition at the end when it's trying to resolve. So if this event is true, we can put it on the stack, and if this event is true, we can resolve this. If it's not true at the end, then we're going to counter it.
So one last thing on the intervening if, because I see players that will make mistakes on this all the time, is if there's an intervening if, I will see a player be like, oh, at the beginning of my upkeep, I'll put this ability on the stack, then I'm going to respond to make it so this event is true, and then we'll resolve the ability. No. If the ability is not true at the beginning of your upkeep or whenever, usually there's a bunch of these that are just like at the beginning of your upkeep. If you have, why am I thinking of that card? Fine. Chance Encounter, at the beginning of your upkeep, if it has 20 or more luck counters on it, you win the game. Well, that ability never goes on the stack unless it already has the 20 or more luck counters on it. How you get luck counters on that card is by winning coin flips. I don't know why I thought of that card, but that's where apparently where I'm at tonight. But yeah, you can't put the ability on the stack because you have 19 counters and then win a coin flip in response. No, it never goes on the stack unless you already have met the condition at the appropriate time.
All right, so some triggered abilities effects are optional. They contain the word may. These abilities go on the stack when they trigger, regardless of whether their controller intends to exercise the ability's option or not. The choice is made when the ability resolves. So
this is where you see the, if you may pay a cost if you do a thing.
So Measure of the Meek, right?
Yeah, that was the one we used last time.
So whenever a creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield, you may pay 1. If you do, draw a card. So this is a triggered ability. It will trigger whenever a creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control. And but you don't have to make the choice about whether you're paying until that triggered ability resolves.
I remember the thing that we used last night for this. So you had a card that you played a little bit called Will Breaker, which just says whenever a creature an opponent controls becomes the target of a spell or ability you control, gain control of that creature. For as long as you control Will Breaker, I believe it's got that text. And then I had posited comboing this card with Yasova Dragonclaw. Yasova Dragonclaw says, at the beginning of combat on your turn, you may pay Blue-Red Hybrid 1. If you do, gain control of target creature with power less than Yasova's power until end of turn. It gains haste.
Yeah.
So the important thing is, like, okay, so I have both of these permanents. John has some big green dudes. Not big green dudes. He has some dudes with power 3 or less because Yasova's a 4. So I go to my combat. I put Yasova's ability on the stack. Then
And he has to choose targets right away.
Yep. I have to choose the target right away, but no, I don't have to pay for this yet.
Yes.
Because you pay for it on resolution. Anything that says if you pay this amount, you don't have to pay that until resolution. You always put the ability on the stack. You always choose any targets as necessary right away, but it's on resolution where you can choose whether or not to do that. So yeah, I target one of his creatures, then Will Breaker will trigger. Will Breaker will give it to me permanently, and then I go to resolve Yasova's ability, and I'm like, no, I'm good. I don't think I need to pay for this ability.
Also, one you were able to do in Magic Origins Limited or the Origins game, if you have that, the duels, Magic Duels, that's what it was. There's Throwing Knives, which is an equipment. Whenever equipped creature attacks, you may sacrifice Throwing Knives. If you do, deal 2 damage to target creature defending player controls. So I can attack with a creature. I can target one of their creatures. I gain control of it with Will Breaker. And I don't have to sacrifice Throwing Knives until resolution.
And I don't think, and actually you can't anymore because the target's illegal. Because it's no longer a creature defending player controls, because now you control it. So you literally, you can't mess that one up.
It might actually be just target creature, but
still, it's a may. You still can choose on resolution not to sacrifice the Throwing Knife, but you still had to choose a target when that ability went on the stack. So, all right. Trigger events that involve objects changing zones are called zone change triggers. Many abilities with zone change triggers attempt to do something to that object after it changes zones. During resolution, these abilities look for the object in the zone that it moved to. If the object is unable to be found in the zone it went to, the part of the ability attempting to do something to the object will fail to do anything. The ability could be unable to find the object because the object never entered the specified zone, or because it left the zone before the ability resolved, or because it is in a zone that is hidden from players, such as a library or an opponent's hand. So, 2 examples of this. There's several different things that say return that card from your graveyard, return that card from exile, and if for some reason it's not in the specified zone, it will not do anything. However, important thing with these zone change triggers, if the card doesn't specify a zone that you're returning it from, it will find it wherever it went. The example I used last night was Return from the Underworld. Loved this card. So Return from the Underworld, it's a 5-cost instant. Sacrifice as an additional cost, you sacrifice a creature. Return At the beginning of your next upkeep, return target creature and the sacrificed creature to the battlefield under your control. Doesn't say where you're returning it from, just says return it. So if there's a replacement effect in place, so trying to remember how. So if let's say my opponent has a Leyline of the Void, now I still have a target creature in my graveyard because I can still have a graveyard. But anything new trying to go there is going to get exiled when I sacrifice my creature. So I cast it, I target my thing, my creature and my spell get exiled immediately. It's replacement effects. So they never go to the graveyard, they go directly to exile, they do not pass go. But then at the beginning of the next upkeep, my delayed trigger ability, which we'll talk about delayed triggers in a little bit here, sets up a zone change trigger and tries to bring them back. Now it returns them, doesn't say where, it doesn't specify, it finds it from whatever zone it went to. So it'll return the target creature from the graveyard, because that's where it was when it was targeted. And then it'll also return the creature I sacrificed, which is currently in exile, to the battlefield as well, because that is the zone it went to from the battlefield. Important also thing to note about this, if the card you sacrifice is your commander, and you use the commander replacement effect to put it in your command zone, Return from the Underworld will find that card from your command zone and allow you to put it onto the battlefield. It is in the rulings. John found it in the rulings. It was more cool yesterday when we talked about this, because John literally found it in the rulings under the card while I was talking about it.
Yeah.
So
Lots of fun.
lots of fun.
Yeah, but so yeah, we can talk about that a little more when we cover replacement effects later.
Yep.
But so enters the battlefield abilities. These trigger when a permanent enters a battlefield.
These are by far the most common triggers.
Yeah. These are written when this object enters the battlefield or whenever a blank enters the battlefield. And each time an event puts one or more permanents on the battlefield, all permanents on the battlefield, including the permanents which are put on there. That's an important distinction. If something enters, it will see itself for any enters the battlefield abilities. They're checked for any enters the battlefield abilities triggers that match that event.
So like Soul Warden, whenever another creature enters, he says whenever another creature enters the battlefield, but if for some reason Soul Warden said whenever a creature enters the battlefield, you gain 1 life when it entered the battlefield, because it would see itself if it didn't say another creature.
There was one which people were talking about. I forget what exactly it was, but I think it was whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you get an energy counter. If you've been following the Kaladesh spoilers.
As judges, we try not to speculate too much on how rules and stuff work with spoilers until we get the FAQ, because the FAQ usually answers 95% of questions we may have. But
given that given no major change in this particular section in the comprehensive rules with Kaladesh, that creature will be able to see itself, because it says whenever a creature enters a battlefield under your control, gain 1 energy. It'll see all other creatures entering as well as itself. And if multiple creatures entered at the same time, including it sees all of them.
Yep.
So yeah.
Okay. So continuous effects that modify characteristics of a permanent do so the moment that the permanent is on the battlefield. Not before then, but there's never a moment where it is on the battlefield where it is not being modified by them. A permanent is never on the battlefield with its unmodified characteristics. Continuous effects don't apply before the permanent is on the battlefield, however. So
let's go back to our Mentor of the Meek.
Yeah, this is where we came up with a cool Mentor of the Meek one yesterday. So Mentor of the Meek, which we talked about, says whenever a creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield, you may pay 1. If you do, draw a card. Now, let's say I have that, and let's say somehow I also have a Dictate of Heliod, which just says creatures I control get +2/+2. Well, my creatures never enter the battlefield without that +2/+2 buff from Dictate of Heliod. So I will not be drawing, unless I have 0 power creatures starting, I will not be drawing any more cards off of my Mentor of the Meek while that's on the battlefield.
Yep. So leaves the battlefield abilities trigger when a permanent moves from the battlefield to another zone. These are written as, but aren't limited to, when this object leaves the battlefield, or whenever something is put into a graveyard from the battlefield. So an ability that attempts to do something to the card that left the battlefield checks for it only in the first zone that it went to. So these are a little bit like
These are somewhat like zone change
Yeah.
triggers, but not completely like zone
Yeah.
change triggers. That's really
Yeah.
it.
but that's pretty much it.
All right. So there are some permanents that have text that reads, "This permanent enters the battlefield with," or "As this permanent enters the battlefield," or "This permanent enters the battlefield as," or "This permanent enters the battlefield tapped." These abilities are all replacement effects, which we'll talk a little bit more about replacement effects once we finish with triggers. But it's important to note that because these are replacement effects, these will happen first. First, your replacement effect happens, then the permanent will actually enter the battlefield, and then if it has an enter the battlefield trigger or any kind of trigger that will trigger, then it will trigger.
Yeah.
But then the main important thing to know is like this permanent enters the battlefield as a copy of something. It'll try to enter the battlefield. You're going to replace that by entering the battlefield as a copy of something. And then if you copy something that has a triggered ability, you will get the triggered ability off of it.
Also, like, triggered abilities use a stack. If it was like a 0/0, which says this creature enters a battlefield with 5+1/+1 counters, well, we don't want to have to wait for the triggered ability to resolve and put 5+1/+1 on there, because state-based actions would check before then and kill it.
Yeah.
It just enters with. There's never a state, just like the continuous effects modifying characteristics of the permanent, there's never a state that these effects have not applied to them where they're on the battlefield. But we'll get into more depth on those in just a minute.
All right. So an effect may create a delayed triggered ability, which we talked about earlier, that can do something at a later time. A delayed triggered ability will contain when, whenever, or at, although that word's not usually going to be the beginning of the ability. Delayed triggered abilities come from spells or other abilities that create them on resolution, or are created as the result of a replacement effect being applied. That means a delayed triggered ability won't trigger until it has actually been created, even if the trigger event occurred just beforehand. So a good example of a delayed trigger from a few years ago is Jace, Architect of Thought. His +1 ability was whenever a creature an opponent controls attacks, it gets -1/-0 until end of turn.
Until your next turn.
No, that one was just until end of turn.
Oh, okay. This is thinking of a different Jace.
Yeah, you're thinking of different Jace. Yeah, and it was a trigger. It didn't happen until that creature an opponent controlled attacked.
No,
no, Jace, Architect of Thought. Look up the card. Talking Jace, Architect of Thought.
Why would it give your opponent's creatures -1/-0 and whenever they attack until end of turn when Planeswalker abilities are at sorcery?
Right. Just okay. I see what you're doing. It set up the delayed trigger that said its +1 was Jace, Architect of Thought.
We're talking on different axes.
Yep.
So until your next turn, whenever an opponent's creature attacks, it gets -1/-0 until end of turn.
There you go. Text.
I was on the
Welcome to the late night version where we can barely remember how magic cards work. Apparently.
Well,
I forgot
Yeah.
key parts of the text on that ability. But yeah, so it sets up a delayed trigger because it says until the beginning of your next turn, whenever a creature an opponent controls attacks you, do those things. So the important part there then with the second part where it's delayed triggered abilities, it means a delayed triggered ability won't trigger until it has actually been created, even if its trigger event occurred just beforehand. So with our Jace, Architect of Thought example, let's say I have a Teferi, the Teferi Planeswalker in play, and I have his ultimate, which says I can activate Planeswalker abilities at any time I can activate an instant. Once something has attacked me, if I then activate Jace +1 and say, creatures set up that triggered ability, well, those creatures have already attacked. I've missed my opportunity to fulfill that triggered ability. So,
all right. Some trigger abilities trigger when a game state, such as a player not having not controlling any permanents of a particular card type, or a permanent not having any counters on it. When that condition is true, they will trigger rather than triggering when an event occurs. These triggered abilities trigger as soon as the game state matches the condition. They'll go on the stack at the next available opportunity, and these are called state triggers. Note that they're not the same as state-based actions, completely different. But, well, not completely different, but
yeah. So a state trigger is looking for a specific game state. Now, a state triggered ability doesn't trigger again. Once it triggers, it's not going to trigger again until the ability has either been resolved, has been countered, or has for some other reason left the stack. Then, if the object with the ability is still in the same zone and the game state still matches the trigger condition, the ability will trigger again. Some triggered abilities trigger specifically when a player loses the game. These abilities trigger when a player loses or leaves the game, regardless of the reason, unless that player leaves the game as a result of a draw. So to our state-based trigger, we're going to look at Dark Depths, because Dark Depths is the prime example of this card. Dark Depths comes into play with 10 counters on it. You can pay 3 mana to remove a counter from it. And it has the state trigger of when this card has no counters on it, you may, or not even may, when this card has no counters on it, sacrifice it. If you do, put a 20/20 flying indestructible creature named Merit Lodge onto the battlefield. I think it dictates that it's a black creature too. But
yeah. But so the big thing with Dark Depths is it will trigger when that state is true. Now it won't just keep on triggering. Basically as long as that trigger is on the stack, it won't trigger again. So let's say your opponent stifles it. Okay, now the triggered ability is no longer on the stack. So the next time a player would get priority, hey, the ability triggers again, assuming the Dark Depths is still on the battlefield and there's still no ice counters on it, which I don't know how it would suddenly get ice counters, but
kind of weird. No ice.
Yeah. But yeah, so basically it just keeps triggering over and over again, but only when there isn't currently one of its iterations with a trigger on the stack. So those are a little unique, but basically you just look at it. Has this thing, is a condition true? Is it currently on the stack? No to both of those, put it on the stack.
True. That is, yep, that is the best way to think about it. That last one, where it talks about, if some triggered abilities will trigger specifically when a player loses the game. This is more important for multiplayer games, because obviously if one of the players loses the game, then usually the game's over. Yeah, these abilities will trigger whenever a player loses or leaves the game, regardless of the reason. Your buddy is, at 137 life in a commander game, and he's got to pack up and go home. Well, anything that cares about players losing the game will still trigger, even though the only reason he's leaving is because he has to concede.
Yeah. The only exception to that is if a player leaves the game as a result of a draw, then those abilities will not trigger.
Draw is technically not a loss, so... yeah, and two losses turn into a draw, I guess, sort of, because if both players lose simultaneously. All right, that just went somewhere. Anyway,
it went somewhere.
All right, so let's talk about replacement effects. So replacement effects, they. All right,
okay.
I'm lost. You talk about replacement effects.
So, and first off, I want to start off. You're probably not going to see much, if anything, about replacement effects on your level 1 test.
Right.
So if you are, if you end up in a situation, hopefully you aren't, you're taking this class, but you're like desperately cramming, trying to get the level 1 test, this isn't something you specifically need to know for that. Now, we want you to know this. Everything we're telling you, we want you to know because it will help you be a better judge. It will help you give better rulings, and just deepen your knowledge of this game, which I love. I think yes. Stacy loves. I hope you love. That's why we're giving this to you, even though it might not come up in your level 1 test.
Knowing what consists of a replacement effect is important.
Yeah.
So replacement effects will have somewhere in their text. Typically, will have the word instead. You are doing something instead of doing whatever you were about to do. Things that are typical replacement effects. Damage prevention is pretty much always a replacement effect because
it's technically its own thing. Damage prevention is technically a prevention effect, but it functions identical to a replacement effect.
Damage redirection is the same thing. It is actually technically its own thing, but they haven't printed damage redirection effects in years, many years, because they're complicated. And they can do the same thing with a damage prevention effect.
Yeah.
So, other things that are replacement effects, primary one in standard and modern actually right now is Kalidas.
Well, the primary really visible one.
Yeah.
Like Kalidas, instead of your opponent's creature dying, you'll get a 2/2 zombie and exile the creature card. Now, there are lots of non-visible replacement effects which we just do. So, hey, you have a land. It enters tapped. Well, that's actually a replacement effect. They are all over. Basically, a land wants to enter the battlefield untapped. That's the default state for entering. But that card has on it printed a replacement effect, which says this card enters the battlefield tapped. Instead of the normal untapped, you're doing this thing. So replacement effects are modifying an action. So replacement effects basically change the way something is happening as it's happening, instead of triggered abilities, which are going to modify. Well, they're going to trigger and then do something after an event has occurred.
Important thing with replacement effects is replacement effects don't use the stack. They just, if
Yes.
they are in play and available, and they see something that they are allowed to try and replace, they apply to that event. I just remember the example we used last night, and we should use that again. So, I have a Notion Thief, and John has a Notion Thief, and we're playing Legacy because I love Legacy. And I attempt to cast Brainstorm, which is kind of dangerous when we both have Notion Thieves, but that's where we're at. So I cast Brainstorm. Brainstorm says draw 3 cards, then put 2 cards from your hand back on top of your library. So I'm going to attempt to have 3 draw events that want to be replaced by his Notion Thief. So I try and draw a card, and his Notion Thief's like, whoa, 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 you're trying to draw a card? I want to replace that by drawing a card. And then his Notion Thief replaces and tries to make him draw a card. And then my Notion Thief's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Now I want to replace that because that's something I can replace. I want to replace that, and I'm going to draw that card now. So then I attempt to draw a card. And his Notion Thief sees it, but it's like, I already tried to get involved with that. I can't get involved with that again.
Yep.
So then I get to draw my Brainstorm card. And, I get to draw my other 2 Brainstorm cards because of the same reason.
And we had a little bit more background built up on that example. So let's break apart that example a little bit.
Sure.
So we have an event, drawing a card, which I have a replacement effect, which is trying to modify that event. First, any replacement effects apply. If there's multiple replacement effects, I get to choose the order, but there's currently only one applying. So I should get his draw. Because I'm greedy, I have a Notion Thief. So we are replacing that event. Now that we are replacing that event, replacement effects, multiple ones can modify an event, and they can sort of chain. Like in this case, I wasn't going to draw a card, but because of my replacement event effect, I am going to draw a card now.
Which now lets my replacement event be able to apply.
Yep. So his Notion Thief is going to steal back that card draw.
Because I am also greedy, and that's why I have a Notion Thief in play.
Yep. Now, to make everything work and make this just not break the game, each replacement effect is limited to one modification of any one event. So in this case, our Notion Thieves can only apply once each. So that's the key thing we were going with that example. We don't get to keep stealing cards back and forth, and the game breaks, and everything's on fire. And yeah,
luckily the Magic Tournament rules usually prevent the game being on fire.
Usually, yeah.
Usually.
So we're just going to apply one replacement effect, then apply the other, and there are no new replacement effects that can apply. So we'll just go from there. Yeah, but the key thing with replacement effects is it's going to modify something. Now, triggered abilities, you see the when, whenever, or at. Replacement effects, you'll often see the instead, or there are a number of them, like this permanent enters the battlefield tapped, or this permanent enters the battlefield with, like +1/+1 counters, or something enters the battlefield as a clone, or as a copy of something else. They'll often say as well. But those are all replacement effects, and they just modify the events. They aren't triggered. They don't use a stack, and the event that would have happened never does end up occurring, as we talked about earlier in the triggered events, triggered abilities.
Also important to note that sometimes you will have multiple replacement effects that affect your permanent. So let's use Kalitas, because Kalitas is a good example. I have a creature that's about to die. John has a Kalitas, but I have a Rest in Peace. So my creature is about to attempt to die, and there are two different things trying to apply to this event. Now, because let's say it's a Grizzly Bear, because Grizzly Bears are in all the judge questions. So my Grizzly Bear is dying. Because I'm the owner and controller of the Grizzly Bear, I get choice as to which replacement effect applies first. So I can either choose to exile it to his Kalitas and give him a zombie, or I can exile it to my Rest in Peace and make John a sad panda. He even has like the pouty face. It's pretty funny. So that is important to note. If multiple replacement effects apply to the same event, the owner of the card or permanent being affected gets the choice.
Yes.
Which actually I think we forgot to mention last night. So little victories in having to do this again?
Yeah. It was a full rehearsal. We'll see if it's actually any improvement.
I don't know, but well, I mean, we did hear ourselves in the first thing, and then I think I got a text from Nita that said we were good on our sound. So I mean, we'll find out quickly enough if things went sour.
Yeah.
So, okay.
But
so
yeah. Anyways, again, just comparing, contrasting. So triggered events, they will trigger. Well, they will trigger whenever their stated condition is true. That trigger will then be put on the stack the next time a player will get priority. Intervening ifs, because they come up a lot, I'm just going to touch on that a little bit. Again, they check at the very beginning, and then they'll check the if clause when they attempt to resolve.
Yeah, and to even go on the stack, both parts need to be true.
Yep.
That's probably the important thing there, because it's usually like at the beginning of some phase, if something is true. Both of those need to be true for the ability to go on the stack.
Yep.
And then the second half still needs to be true for it to resolve.
Yeah.
And do what you want it to do.
So triggered abilities, they trigger, they will then go on the stack.
I remember the delayed trigger that we used last night. It was Final Fortune. So, and this is important because delayed triggers can be a little bit confusing. So Final Fortune as a card, I'm going to go through the example because it helps with the delayed trigger thing. Delayed triggers usually set things up at a very specific time. Now, most of them are like, at the beginning of the next end step, exile this card. At the beginning of your next upkeep, exile these cards. Sometimes they say something very specific. So Final Fortune says, is red, it's an instant. No, it's an instant.
Okay.
Yeah, it's an instant. Because it goes on an Isochron Scepter. Because there is an old extended deck called Final Fantasy built around this card where you would get Final Fortune on an Isochron Scepter and then have a Platinum Angel in place. You couldn't lose the game. But
sure.
Final Fortune, relevant thing here. So it's red, instant, take an extra turn after this one. At the end of that turn, you lose the game. So it's a delayed trigger. It's a triggered ability, so if you have a stifle, you can stifle it. Important thing to note, it says at the end of that turn. So if for some reason you have an ability that makes you skip a turn and you skip your Final Fortune turn, you do not lose the game because that trigger was set up for that specific turn.
Yeah.
Most triggers will say, at the beginning of your next upkeep or the beginning of your next end step, but there are some weird ones that will at the beginning of a specific time.
Yeah. Yeah. Triggers. They trigger, they go on the stack the next time a player will get priority, and then they resolve with intervening if, having a condition, checks, and any costs you'll pay at the resolution. Replacement effects, on the other hand, they just modify an event that would occur. So instead of that happening, something slightly different happens, or very different, depending on what the effect is.
Mhm.
And they do not use a stack. And the event that would have happened never actually ends up happening. So just a quick compare contrast. But yeah, I think that is pretty much this week. Now we have a couple of housekeeping things.
Yep. Go through that quick.
So we're switching to YouTube Live. So I looked at options a little bit over the past week. YouTube Live seems to do pretty much what we needed.
Everything that we needed to do.
So
I mean, there'll be a YouTube chat. A lot of our links and things that we've been putting in the showcase, that's just all going to have to go into the chat.
Yep.
But we will have a live YouTube chat. So again, if there are any questions or things as we're going through live, people can go ahead and ask us questions at the time.
Yeah, and we will. So for you viewers, like, not much will change. Like you said, the chat instead of the showcase plus the Q&A, but we'll just post the link to the YouTube Live video in the Rochester Judge Class Facebook page.
So there's not going to be really any change at all.
Yeah. And then you'll just go follow that link, and you can watch us live or at a later time. Both of those will just work exactly like they've been working.
Just like a normal podcast if you watch any other podcasts.
Yep.
So.
So also we have October 2nd. So that's a judge mob. The Rochester Judge Mob, which we talked about last week. We will be having Chipotle and we'll be having Chipotle and judge fun, whether it be EDH or draft or whatnot. We'll also be doing testing. So this is like a primary date for testing you people who are in the southeast Minnesota area. So we really hope you will be able to make that day. If you're not able to make that, or even if you are and plan on testing, please contact us prior to that date. We'll harp on you more about that later. But
because we want to be able to set up, know how many people we're going to be testing, be able to have tests and things prepared, and we just want to know that ahead of time so that we know, so that we can prepare appropriately.
Yeah.
So
if you're outside of our area, also contact us. We can help you get in touch with like a local L2 or just even the regional coordinator for your area, and we can hook you up with a way to get tested. But yeah, I'm really excited for this judge mob. It should be a lot of fun. There will be Chipotle, so there's good food.
It's Sunday, October 2nd. It's going to be at Games and More in Byron, and it is starts at noon. If you are testing, you can show up at 11. We can get you started testing right away at 11. So that way you can get through it and then not really miss much of the judge mob. We'll probably be going from starting at noon until probably 4 or 5.
I'd put 6 for the event.
You put 6? Okay.
Because
I know
EDH will probably
I know that the owner would like to go home at some point, so 6 seems like a reasonable time.
Yeah.
So
and there will probably be there will be food there, so I don't know if there will actually be a dinner afterwards, but there might be.
There might be.
But
it is a thing judges sometimes tend to do. So.
Yeah. So again, really excited about that. It should be a lot of fun, and it'll be a great way to meet new judges in the area, as well as the perfect chance to test for level 1, and hopefully if we've done our job right, pass that test. So yeah, I think that is.
And then next week's class is going to be. I wanted to go over the outline. Can you pop up the outline quick? Because this is actually the last week that's actually on rules and rules interactions. Next week we're going to be talking about the Judging at Regular REL document. It is a 2-page document that tells you how to handle game mistakes and problems at 98.5% of all Magic played, because that's 98.5% of all Magic is at regular REL. And that's just sanctioned Magic. That doesn't even include people playing Commander on their kitchen tables. So the Judging a Regular document will help you fix... The reason we spent an entire week on it is because, one, it's important. It helps you with policy things at your FNMs and your local events that aren't competitive REL. And if you're looking at competitive REL, realistically, with the restructuring of the judge program, if you're looking at judging a competitive REL, you should probably look at eventually getting to level 2.
Yeah.
Just throwing that out there. The other reason that we want to spend an entire week on the judging irregular REL document is because it is a good percentage of the test. It is going to be 7 to 8 questions of your 25 question test. So it's important for us to spend a week looking at it.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I said, it's only 2 pages, but it's all fairly important, so I want to make sure we spend a lot of time on it.
So the week after that, we'll talk about the Magic Tournament rules. So this is a much longer document. Sort of, the writing is almost freeform.
Yeah.
At points.
We're going to touch on some key points in it. A lot of the stuff on that's not going to necessarily be on the judge test, but it is important things to know on some of like how rules work. There's also some corner case stuff written in there, which is useful to know.
Yeah.
So then after that, we're going to do a week on our week 10 will just be our review week. We will have a Google Docs for our test, for our practice test that we'll have people take. And then we're going to highly recommend that you take that and submit the answers to the Google Doc, because then we're going to use that as our basis for the class that week, because we're just going to go over things that people had issues with in those practice tests. So
highly, highly encourage you to take that once we get it out. Like, help us help you to pass the level 1 test. We can, just sit up here in the review week and talk about random things all day, but if we have some idea of any areas you might be struggling with, that's really helpful.
It's better for you.
Yeah.
So so how that'll work. So next week we're going to talk about the judging irregular REL document. Normally we've been putting up our practice tests on the Friday before. We're going to put up our practice tests like the day after we talk about judging irregular REL.
Yeah.
Because we want to give you time to be able to do the practice test on your at a time
after the MTR.
Oh yes, after the MTR week. My bad. But I'm sorry. It's like 11 o'clock here, and I have to be up early. So losing my my focus here. So does that basically cover it? Because
yeah.
All right. Well, in that case, I'm Stacy Winchell.
I'm John Aratunji, and thank you for joining us for week 7 of the online judge class.
Thank you.